It really gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this opening keynote controversy uh, panel discussion entitled Elections, Riots, Distrust, What's the State of Democracy? And as those of you who heard my opening remarks, you will know that the state of democracy is something that runs through as a theme of this festival. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Academy of Ideas, and I suppose this is a scene setter for that idea that possibly democracy itself is feeling fragile and under strain, under pressure from all sides. We have they're all the same, what's the point in voting sentiment. We have a feeling of disenfranchisement as voting systems seem to exclude huge swathes of the electorate from representation. We have the way that the ballot box is no longer seen as the last word in an election, with losers' consent no longer given, a very dangerous trend that's occurred. We also have attempts all around Europe by some mainstream parties to do whatever it takes to isolate, discredit, even demonize, even ban electorally popular populist parties. And as we saw, whether relating to Brexit or the reaction to the summer riots, certain citizens are being shunned and labelled as being beyond democratic engagement. Now, I'm exaggerating some of these trends, but you will recognize them. And I think it's a legitimate question to ask whether democracy can survive all these kind of attacks. So, to calm me down, I hope, and reassure me, I've got a fabulous panel. For those of you who haven't been to the festival before, I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. They've been given a very strict 6 to 7 minutes each to answer all of those questions. And then after that, we'll be coming straight out to the audience. You'll be giving questions that will then allow the panel to interact with each other. So let me introduce this panel, and I'm really pleased to have them. First of all, we've got Luke Tryl, who is the executive director of More in Common UK. He's one of the people, he's got his kind of weird, I'm a bit starstruck because every time I see him, he's on the telly. And he's one of the people on the television that I always listen to. He always makes me think. More in Common UK is an increasingly influential and certainly invaluable public opinion research organisation that works to shine a light on what the public really thinks on topics as diverse as immigration, climate change, gender identity, mental health. And their emphasis is on nuance and complexity. Also, he's got a political background. He was once a special advisor to Nicky Morgan and was director of strategy at Ofsted. And it's the first time speaking about ideas. I'm delighted to have him here. So that's great, Luke. We've then got Tina Stowell, who is Baroness Stowell, who chairs the Communication and Digital Select Committee at the House of Lords, although she's here because she's one of the most interesting members of the House of Lords, not because of her title. She's a former cabinet minister and leader of the House of Lords. She spent 10 years at the BBC, was chair of the Charity Commission. But as I said, she's one of the most interesting voices in the chamber, in the other place. And you can follow her on Twitter or X to see the kind of work that she gets into. She's always trying to dig beneath the headline. Then we've got Josh Simons, who is a new Labour MP for Makerfield, former director of Labour Together, Britain's biggest political think tank. Josh is also an expert in data, technology, and public services, and his recent book is Algorithms for the People, Democracy in the Age of AI. And I'd like to commend Josh for speaking here because I think it's very important that our new MPs actually get out there and engage with the public. And as soon as I asked Josh, he said yes. And that takes some doing because a lot of people, when I ask them, run the other way. But hopefully he'll have a good time here. We've then got Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. Now, she is a columnist and commentator for The Telegraph, Unheard, GB News, BFM TV in Paris, one of my favourite European commentators. Her coverage and analysis of the recent French elections was really totally spot on, but also invaluable, helped me untangle all of the ins and outs of it. And her most recent book was a collective work, Illiberalism in Europe, which seems very appropriate as a theme for what we're discussing here today. So I'm delighted she's come from France to speak today. And then finally, Professor Frank Furedi, a sociologist and social commentator, post-academic life. He's making real waves in his role as executive director of MCC Brussels, the author of over 25 books, including many that are invaluable guides in relation to democracy. But his most recent is The War Against the Past, Why the West Must Fight for Its History. And Frank is one of our advisors and a regular at the Battle of Ideas. But what a panel, eh? Give him a round warm of applause. Okay, to kick us off then, Luke.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Claire. It's great to be invited. Unfortunately, in what I'm going to say, I don't think I'm going to provide you with the reassurance that you were looking for. I was rewatching the Lord of the Rings trilogies recently, that great Peter Jackson production. And there's a line in there, bear with me, this does link to democracy. There's a line in there where Saruman the wizard says to Gandalf, "The hour is later than you think." And I think that is where we are when it comes to the state of our democracy. And I'm going to give you three figures which hopefully hammer that point home. They are 31%, 76%, and 62%. Just 31% of the UK public think that democracy is working at the moment. 76% of the public think that the system is rigged towards the rich and influential. And I think most damning of all, 62% of the public don't think that our politicians are up to dealing with the big challenges that our country faces. All in all, there is a deep and pervasive unhappiness with the status quo. And throughout the election campaign, I ran around 50 focus groups. And when I tell you, it was sometimes like being hit by a battering ram of disillusionment. I'm not exaggerating. The public were deeply unhappy, not just with the outgoing government, but with the system itself, which they felt was letting them down. And I think what was so striking and what bears stressing is it wasn't just one group in the public. So I could be speaking to voters in what's become known as the Red Wall in the north of England, in the Midlands, and they would tell me how disappointed they were that promises on levelling up hadn't been kept. But I could also speak to Muslim voters in Birmingham who would tell me how neglected they felt by the Labour Party, the fact that they hadn't been listened to. You could speak to inner city young professionals who thought, I've done the right thing. I've gone and, I've got a degree. I've worked hard. I've paid all of this money in. And yet I'm in my 30s and I'm still having to share a house with 4 other people. You'd even speak to, people in Surrey in those leafy blue wall seats who would like, something's just not quite right. Although I have to say my empathy slightly drained with the guy who said, and I haven't even been able to turn my hot tub on all summer because of the cost of living inflation. But, everyone experiences this in their own way. And what that led to in this election, I think it's important not to see what happened in July as a standalone event, but actually as the third part of a trilogy. And that trilogy was in 2016, the public voted for Brexit. In 2019, they voted to get Brexit done. And in 2024, they voted to get the buggers out. And in each of those elections, the common theme was that the public was saying, we're not happy. We think some quite radical change needs to happen. And when I talk about getting the buggers out, it wasn't just the Tories. In fact, the biggest predictor at that election of you losing vote share was being an incumbent. So incumbent MPs, whether they were Conservatives, whether they were in the SNP or in Labour, all in aggregate lost vote share as people went to the smaller parties. Now, there's one world in which people going to smaller parties, having more choice on offer is a good thing. But that wasn't what was motivating, right? People weren't going to smaller parties because, well, it's great. I can vote for a Green Party now. I can vote for Reform UK. I can vote for an independent. They were doing it as a symbol of protest. And what's interesting is if you look at that unhappiness, that unease, it is just transferred to after the election, right? I think there were some people who were expecting that when the election happened, and as some people put it, you may agree or disagree with them, there were grown-ups back in the room, as it was put, that things would be different. But they're not. It's not different. If you look at our latest polling, Keir Starmer's approval rating has fallen by 50 points since July. In our last poll, the Conservatives and Labour were tied. That wasn't a result of some great triumph on the part of the Conservatives, who are still at 27%. The two main parties were getting 54% of the vote between them. 2017, it was 84%. So something has changed very quickly, very rapidly. Reform UK now on 21% in our polling. But I think it's clear that the new government has made some early missteps, and we can debate what those missteps might be, whether it is the freebies, the winter fuel allowance, the tone of gloom. But actually, if you look at what has happened, even given that fall is so quick, and it's because I think we've heard a lot, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot in the run-up to the budget about the financial black hole that they did or didn't inherit from the last government. I think what's less talked about is the trust black hole that they inherited. And what that means is that people are just not willing to give politicians the degree of slack that they might have done in the past. And what we get from our focus groups is people have seen things like the freebies, or they've seen the decision on winter fuel allowance, and they're basically going, oh my God, it's just going to be more of the same, isn't it? We're not going to get that change that we thought we were getting. So what might the panel want to talk about doing that? And I'm conscious I've got about 30 seconds left. I think my job was just to set the scene and leave the answers to others. But I think there are 5 things that need to change, and I'll just canter through them very quickly. 1, the public just need to feel less exhausted. We need to get out of this sense of perma-crisis that has persisted basically since the financial crash in 2008. They need to feel that everyday life is less of a struggle, that getting a GP appointment isn't like trying to complete the Hunger Games. They need to feel that politicians respect them, and that respect isn't about having a degree or living in London or being wealthy, but about your contribution to society. And if there's one thing I can leave you with, is that link seems to have been broken to the public between contribution, what you put in, and what you get out. And the number of times I hear from people, and this is where I'll end, I work hard, I do my bit, and I've got nothing to show for it at the end of the month. And until you tackle that, our democracy is going to struggle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That was an excellent scene setter, and actually dug deeply into the question rather than just superficially. So I think great start. Tina.
Thank you, Claire. And I think a lot of what I'm going to say will echo and complement what we just heard from Luke, which is clearly not very encouraging. However, there is one aspect of democracy which does give me some hope, which is that I think since 2016, what voters have discovered is the power of their vote in terms of forcing disruption and upending the status quo. We've seen that the surprise and the shock through the result of 2016, also the general election in 2017, as well as what Luke referred to in 2019 and this year. We are now in an era where there is no such thing as a safe seat. The problem, I think, is that those of us in the political class don't understand that we are the problem when it comes to the way people feel about democracy. And that's because we seem to be either willfully misunderstanding or resisting understanding what it is and the scale of change and improvement that the voters want from us. Now, I think there's always been a healthy cynicism about politicians. But for me, this current wave of disaffection started in 2008 with the financial crash, because what that exposed then was what people had suspected for too long, that those who claimed to have superior knowledge were not as clever as they thought they were after all. Because whilst in the past, a sort of sense of superiority, if you like, from the ruling classes was tolerated. It was tolerated because the social contract was one that seemed to work okay. After 2008, it became apparent that not only was it not working, but the people who had claimed this new approach, whether you want to call it globalization or not, was not working to anybody's advantage apart from those who seem to be making all of the decisions. And in saying that, by the way, I'm not arguing against. I don't think you can defeat globalization, as it were. I think it's just the way in which it was advanced and the complete disregard and denial of the impacts on different parts of society and an unwillingness to introduce mitigations. Once we then got into the expensive scandal of 2009, that made matters worse because then people also had proof in terms of what they'd long thought about politicians being in it for themselves. Now, the reason why I rehearsed some of this background is because, as Claire said in her introduction, we are living in an increasingly complex world, and what is going to be necessary if politicians or business leaders are going to come forward with complex solutions to these complex problems is for them to be trusted, because people aren't going to understand a lot of the technological shifts, and they can only trust people if they feel that through our actions and our decisions we have demonstrated we share and understand common concerns and common values. And that's what we have failed to do sufficiently in that period since 2008. And when it got to 2016, what the referendum presented was an opportunity for people to actually, if you like, that all of the villains as they saw them were sort of lined up on one side, and it was possible to vote against them and actually make a difference. And as we've heard from Luke, since then, I think we as politicians have made things worse by doing things like campaigning for a second referendum on Europe. The initial support there was for the Extinction Rebellion's serious disruption, because this seemed to be tolerated because people thought it was all in a good cause. There was the inconsistent tolerance and application of the rules during COVID, depending on which issues people were protesting about. We've had Parliament's ongoing dilution and frustration of any new laws to deal with preventing illegal immigration or limiting legal migration. And the way in which politicians have dealt with that has been almost with a sense of distaste for what it is that the majority have been wanting. The chaos in my own party and the failure plus removal of a prime minister in whom so many people had vested so much confidence to deliver what they'd voted for, followed by, or indeed preceded by, the zest and glee from some media commentators and the opposition to Boris's character flaws, believing that they were morally superior and that by pointing to his flaws, they were being proved right, that the voters had been wrong to support him and not them. So I think that come earlier this year, the election was clearly a vote of no confidence in the Conservatives, and people were determined to get us out. And as we've heard from Luke, people desperately wanted things to change. But the results themselves in July show that there wasn't a lot of confidence in the kind of change that Keir Starmer and the Labour Party were offering. And I think that, compounded by some of the moral superiority that has come from Keir Starmer in the past, and now being very much undermined by what we've seen with some of his the kind of whole gifts and what have you, is undermining yet further people's confidence. So I think this underlying anxiety continues. I think as far as the riots in the summer were concerned, clearly all decent people would condemn without equivocation the demonstrations, the violence and the hatred. And I think it was good that the Prime Minister and the police were able to bring these things under control. But I think what troubles me was the introduction of describing a lot of this as far right, and far right being a label that was used quite often by the Prime Minister and others during that period. And because far right is such an ill-defined term, and we know that that gets often thrown around when people talk about the Reform Party, and therefore the people who vote for reform think that they are being described as the far right. This kind of conflation of issues when politicians are talking about violence and hatred on the streets versus those who express unacceptable views on social media is causing yet more concern that we are unable to distinguish between acts of violence, unacceptable language, and people's legitimate disaffection with the political class. All of this, I fear, is going to continue to fuel public trust. So I guess in conclusion, and it sort of very much supports what Luke has said, I don't think democracy is in peril because of the voters. I don't even think democracy is in peril because of our electoral system. I'm not actually in favour of changing it. I think what voters have demonstrated is first past the post actually works. What is the reason why democracy is in peril is because of us politicians, and because we are still claiming to be superior to voters. We act in a way which seems to think that we are superior, whilst we are not doing enough through our actions to show we understand where we've gone wrong, and we're not changing our approach in putting things right. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. A refreshingly honest appraisal of where we are. And as we know, that's a rarity amongst politicians. Let's see if Josh can live up to it. Right, Josh.
Well, Tina's slightly less subject to the wit than I am, so she gets a bit of a pass. So I love forums like this. I think ideas are the lifeblood of democracy, and I'm really glad to be part of this, even as an elected MP. I've already seen 3 journalists that I know, so I'm just going to tell you right now, I am not speaking on behalf of the Labour government or the Labour Party. I am an MP. If you really want to twist something that I say and put it in an article, go ahead, but please send it to me first. I would be grateful. I also care very much about the question on the table. In a sense, everything I've done in my life, the 5 years I spent working in the tech sector, writing a book, standing for Parliament myself, trying to reform a think tank in this country that is avowedly and openly political rather than pretending not to be. All of these are, in a sense, about democracy. It's the thing that I care most about. So I want to try and put out an argument to be knocked down rather than give you a kind of history of how we got here. And the argument is this, that this country's democracy is in better health than many of our peers, but this country's state is a miserable, tangled, ineffective mess. And when the state is a miserable, tangled, ineffective mess, it has all sorts of downstream consequences for how democracy works, in particular, that the connection between frustration, voting, replacing the people in power, and seeing change doesn't work. And that connection in this country is not working properly. So what do we need to do to fix democracy? Radically reform the connection between the state and democratic institutions. That's essentially what I'm going to say. So let me just be a little bit more precise about what I mean. Democracy in this, and we don't have to argue about the words, but just so I'm clear about the point I'm making. Democracy in what I'm saying is elections. It's the institutions of democracy, it's Parliament. It's to some extent the faith that people have, not that democracy will deliver for them, but that they'd rather have democracy than some other form of political system. And that there are worrying trends there, but the vast majority of the British public still believe they'd rather have democracy as opposed to anything else. The state, on the other hand, the point of a state is to give effect in a democracy to the people who have a mandate to effect the change that they promise. That's the point of a state. Why do we all do our jobs in politics? I want to win power. I want to be in the cabinet so that I can control an institution that allows me to effect change in the society. That's the basic structure of how it works. When that institution is broken and it doesn't allow you to do half the things you want to do, it incentivizes risk aversion. It incentivizes avoiding hard choices. It incentivizes short time horizons. And the effect of all of those things is a public that quite rightly, slowly, bit by bit, but surely gets more and more pissed off. Not in one big blow, not in one big sort of dramatic moment, but bit by bit, they begin to think every time I go to the ballot box and then I change who's in power or I vote on a constitutional question, nothing changes. And that is a deep and serious problem that we must fix. So let me just quickly tell you why I think democracy's here not as bad as it is in some places. Unlike some of my colleagues, I thought Brexit was a constitutional question. It always was. And once the British public had voted, we had to deliver it. That was the bottom line. So I think it is a good thing for democracy that Brexit has happened, and we should not forget that. The last election was a celebration of the median voter. My wife's American. We talk about the differences between our system a lot. You can knock the disparity between the number of seats that Labour got in Parliament and the vote share it got. But what it really means is that political parties in this country are incentivized to ruthlessly focus on the median voter. When those voters decide elections, democracy tends to work better. And the flip side of the same idea is, can you imagine in Congress if the House of Representatives ever had a situation in which the number of seats that just changed hands? Impossible, because they're gerrymandered. And in parliaments all over the world, the number of seats that have just changed hands in the House of Commons is an extraordinary thing, and it is good for democracy. It is about refreshing politicians. It is about energy, lifeblood, injecting it into the core of our parliament, and it is what voters wanted. So that is good too. We are not also socially polarized like some countries are. When we import this language from America of the culture wars, that's not a representation of the vast majority of the British public. When you map, as Luke often does, public opinion across a whole range of moral questions, actually the public are not cemented into two immovable blocks at all. Again, that is a good thing for democracy. However, the bad. And my contention is that all of these bad things are actually at base about the connection between the political institutions of democracy, who has power when they win elections, and the state, what they can actually do with that power, what that power means for citizens. Trust is never lower. People don't think voting makes any difference. They don't think national politics makes any difference to their lives. When I hit the campaign ground in Wigan, one of the things I was struck by is voters not showing out. It's not to do with apathy. It's not because they can't be asked. They've got better things to do. They're angry. They're really angry. They don't think their time is well spent in that ballot box because they don't think it makes any difference. That's a problem. Low turnout is generally often about anger rather than apathy. And now, having been elected, every institution I find in the British state, in some ways, has an unthinking, latent institutional conservatism built into it. And I have no problem with being conservative. I do have a problem when you don't know why. If you think things should be done the same way, and you can't explain why. And everywhere you look, in Parliament, in the House of Commons, in Whitehall, these institutions will not change, but they don't know why. And that's a problem because voters want change, as Tina said. One minor example of this is, why can't we get 650 MPs outside the House of Commons so they can fix the damn building and then go back in 6 years? Why can't we do that? It's so simple, and yet we can't. We cannot make it happen. So here's my contention. Most of these problems are about the weakness and the ineffectiveness of the British state, not about the political institutions and norms that make democracy work. If we get the state working properly, we will fix problems that are often laid at the feet of British democracy. So here's a mad list to end, because I know I've got about a minute and a half. 1 minute, not even a half. Here's a mad list of reforms, of things that we could do. I'm just going to say these and put them out here without any explanation whatsoever. We need fewer site halls in Whitehall. We need way more expertise and way fewer generalists in Whitehall. We need a beefed up centre of the British state, which separates politics and the civil service much more cleanly and empowers those with mandates. Politics has to drive what the civil service does. We need more centralised procurement skills, better use of data. We obviously need to reform judicial review, and I say that as a Labour MP. We need to value public institutions again and build them, an FDR era in which we value the authority and power of a public institution that the public recognise and see themselves in. But we also need to recognise that parliamentary sovereignty is a myth. The people are sovereign. And that has all kinds of implications for our constitution that we need to cash out right the way through them. Sovereignty in practice flows up in this country. That's what we saw with the Scottish referendum, not down. and we should be reforming the British state to reflect that. Local authorities don't work when the elected mandates that people have do not match the powers that councillors actually have to effect the change. There's no connection between what you vote for and what change you want to see. So it's no wonder that about 30% of people only show out. And anybody that is truly devolved has to be able to default. Unless you can borrow money and default, devolution isn't real. So I will stop there. If we did a few of those things, I think you would repair that connection between democracy and the state, and that would do some of the big things that we need to fix democracy.
Thanks, Jeff. So I like that. I think it's always good to have an argument and a thesis, and that kind of distinction with the state and democracy is very important. And then we also like a bit of practical bits at the end. So that was very, very useful, Josh. Thank you very much. Anne-Elisabeth, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. And I must say that listening to the three previous speakers, I'm fascinated by how much the debate actually is framed in the same way in France. And we are a different country. We are a country where, if you look at the title of this panel, elections and riots have always been in lockstep. We glorify the riots and then we have elections. Yes, so this is not new. But the lack of trust, too, you would think that France wouldn't have the same kind of problem because we are a country where there is little trust. I'm always fascinated by British and especially American society and the level of a horizontal trust that people have in one another, and which they are actually perceiving to be disappearing because the bonds of trust that existed in a recognizable American and British culture seem to be disappearing. But in France, we're a country where your neighbors turn you into the police. And I'm not talking about the 1940, 1945 time. I'm talking about the St. Bartholomew massacre. A great French historian has just written a book about the using all the anonymous letters and all the court cases and the justice investigations and the executions that devolved from people denouncing the neighbors as being secret Protestants. And by the way, I really would like to have his flat or house. So we invented nothing. We're not a country of trust. And still, there was enough trust that when we've lost it, we feel how much we've lost it. And this election, the wonderful, glorious, extraordinary mess that gives me so many opportunities to write, it was all contained in the arrival of Emmanuel Macron. And Emmanuel Macron seemed to be the dream, the French dream. The French dream is somebody who comes from the deep state, has, aced those exams and those competitive, the sort of concours that you have to pass in order to be acceptable in polite society in Paris. And so we had somebody who was both outside, a disruptor, somebody nobody knew, but we could trust him because he came from the state and he was our Brexit vote in so many ways. Here is this man who in 2016 says, I want to be president. And in 2017, he's elected president. And he's got this sort of crazy and hysterical campaign, 200,000 people volunteer happily and sort of, canvass people, go door to door. And I'll remind you, we're not a trust country. So this is a very new thing. So what people were doing, I didn't vote for him because I'm a wily old bird and I thought, yes, this is too shiny. I don't believe in it. But people voted because, like you said, they wanted to kick the bastards out and they were all aligned, the socialist, he was part of a socialist government and they were, the hit between the eyes. François Hollande, the socialist president, did not even run again. And the right was said to be sort of old people. And then he said, I can do en même temps, at the same time. I can take the best from the left. I can take the best from the right. And we can make something different. And of course he didn't. That the style was entirely different. It was incredibly even more top down. You had this man who was popular and sort of, shaking hands in this wonderful campaign. And when he's inaugurated, the first thing he does is he speaks in the courtyard of the Louvre Museum at a high days. And he's separated from the crowd by 100 meters, which he walks alone. I mean, you cannot more figure somebody as being the king. And then just, in case we didn't miss the reference, he said, the French want a Jupiterian president. I am Jupiter. And it went downhill from there because it was bound to do. But what happened, and he became unpopular, but still, when he was pitted against Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Rally, the revamped and renamed National Front, at the last election 2 years ago in 2022, it feels like a century, people looked at her and they thought, I'm not sure she's a fascist, but I'm pretty sure she's incompetent. And that was why she didn't go through. And there were enough people on the left who said, no, what she says is not what I believe in. It's not me. It's not the country. It's not France. It's not the tradition. We're not going to elect somebody whose father so obviously came from unpleasant parts of French society. I've just mentioned them before. And so she failed. And then she plodded on, but she's been plodding on. She's been rebranding her party. She's been making it much more acceptable. The Overton window has moved at the same time, where you can now talk about immigration and you still get the ritual insults. But there's also many more possibilities to actually look at the fractures in society, that an immigration that you do not control and that you do not choose, and that you then inflict on people who don't know how they're going to cope with practical things, social services, etc. That is something that has moved. And there's also a feeling of that the French identity is being lost for the same reasons. So what happened at the European elections was the European elections are the only PR vote that we have in France. And therefore what it is, and has been traditionally ever since we started having them, is a life-size poll. And Macron got clobbered because it was easy and it was supposed to have no consequences, really. It was really, we mean it next time. And he looked at it. He had a fit of pique. You have to realize that Emmanuel Macron wanted to be an actor. He really wanted to be a classical actor. And he has acted his presidency in some way. He's performed his presidency. We look deep for sincerity and don't always find it. But he looked at the results. The results were saying, we want you out. And he called a snap election. He had an uncertain house. We have a very different system in France, but he didn't have entirely a majority. So every single major bill had to be passed with alliances, which could happen or could not happen. If not, there is a constitutional disposition in France, Article 49.3 of the French Constitution. I'm sure you're happy to know this, in which the Prime Minister puts the collective responsibility of its cabinet on the line, and if you vote against this bill, then I will, if you do not want it, I will ram through this bill with this article. I will ram through this bill, and if you're not happy, you have to then have a vote of distrust, a lack of trust in my government. But it worked. He passed his pensions reform. And then came this. He called the snap election. The snap election was not necessary from a house in which he lacked 15 to 20 MPs for a majority. He found himself in a house where he had no majority whatsoever, and the country has been divided in three feuding blocks. And those three feuding blocks who didn't have time, and that was entirely Macron's design. He gave them 3 weeks to bring in an election. The National Rally, even not being prepared, came broadly, 11 million votes against 7 million votes for the left and 6 million votes for the Macroniste. And in the second round, the other two ganged together and said, this is the anti-fascist front, no passerà. And we're now left in the situation where there is no trust. There is a cabinet that comes from the weakest party in the House, people who've got 48 MPs when the left front have got 190 and the right has the National Front have got National Rally have got 140 and Macron's people have got 110 or something. It is essentially a mess. My figures are not entirely accurate, but that's the proportion. And we don't know what we're facing, but we are facing this in a country where you talked about the state, the importance of the state. The importance of the state has been the Constitution of France, so we do not trust our state any more than you do. And therefore, I will end because I'm over my time, but we are coming from a different way of doing politics, but we are facing exactly the same thing that Britain is.
Thank you very much.
I think it is very important, and which is why I'm so delighted that you've just spoken in that way. It is very important for us in the UK As people may or may not know, I'm rather pleased that we left the European Union, but that's not to suggest that one isn't interested in the world or part of the world, and knowing what's happening in Europe and seeing what's happening around the world is essential. And I think that example about what's happening in France gives you a sense of a more existential moment that we're all facing. Frank has also been involved in international, but you finish off the conversation, right?
Yeah, so I'm very excited about Europe, as I am about Britain, precisely because what people call the problem of trust is actually when the little boy tells the emperor, you got no clothes, and basically says you're a bunch of bullshitters. And finally comes to the conclusion that perhaps there's going to be an answer that is reliant upon elected professional politicians solving their problem. And I think that's a positive thing. I don't think it's possible to discuss the problem of democracy if we accept the way it's presented. Because almost everything you hear in the media about democracy and its problems is seen through the prism of a very small section of society. It's a bit like when you listen to the BBC Today program or all the people that are associated with that. They have a particular vision. So from their point of view, democracy works really, really well when the debate is really about fairly limited, narrow issues. So, for example, democracy is okay if you have very furious debates about taxation. Democracy is really brilliant when Parliament really gets involved in a discussion of MPs, sort of expenses. Things are really fine if the discussion is about urban planning, all that kind of technical stuff. But the minute you raise issues that go way beyond the normal, boring stuff that Parliament is very passionate about, that is seen as somehow extreme. That is seen somehow as radicalizing, populist even. And I think that it's quite important to realize that when people talk about democracy being under pressure now, which I think is a good thing, is because a lot of people are not satisfied with merely having a furious debate about how many percentage that tax is going to go up by. But there are other questions that excite the imagination. In the world you live in, people look around their everyday life and they see it's changing, not always to the good. It's changing not because they were participant in bringing that change about, but because this is something that has happened to them. So I think that's important to realize. People are struggling for a voice in Europe as they are here. I think that's a wonderful development. For example, I live in Faversham, a small Kentish town. We had a by-election last week in one of our wards, which has always voted for Labour, always voted for Labour. And yet, we had an election where the person that won the vote was from the Lib Dems. Reform came second, Conservatives came third, and Labour came fourth. And what people were doing there was experimenting. They were involved in a political experimentation where they're looking for some solutions to their problems. They don't know what party is good, what party is bad. But the very fact that they understand that the automatic voting in the old way, at least to that end, I think was really, really very, very good. I think that for us, if we want to take democracy seriously in the years ahead, we've got to challenge the language in which its form and its problems are represented. So, for example, just listen to the words they use. If you don't vote for a mainstream party, if you happen to be somebody that doesn't vote for Labour or the Tories, it's invariably called a protest vote. Have you ever heard that expression? It's just a protest vote, right? As if somehow that's kind of morally inferior to a non-protest vote. Not realizing that when people make a decision to vote in a particular kind of a way that rejects the pre-existing mainstream, they're actually making a fairly brave decision. They're saying enough is enough. They may not know exactly what kind of world they want to build, but they know that what they certainly do not want is more of the same. And very often these protests, when Brexit was a very good example of that, these idiots are just protesting against something. They don't know what they're doing, what they are in for. Not realizing that actually it's got a liberating impulse that is behind it, that at some point can lead to a transcendence from the existing rigid technocratic status quo. If you're a populist, right? If for some reason you see yourself as a populist, and these days it's very difficult to self-identify as a populist because you get shut down as far right or fascist or whatever. If you're a populist, then you are divisive. I mean, the two words go hand in hand. Populism and divisiveness go hand in hand, as if there's something wrong with being divisive. I mean, people forget that when democracy was forged in ancient Athens, it was one of the most sort of argumentative society in human history. It was a risk-taking, argumentative society, and being divisive and political divisions were understood as not a problem, but as a good thing, as a prelude to coming to some kind of clarity and clarification. And just down the line, when you look at the language, basically what it's saying is that democracy is what existed in the post-war era, the 50s and the 60s. That's democracy. And the more we get away from the old-fashioned political system, that's a problem, right? And you have to remember that in the 50s and 60s, both the Tories and the Labour argued very often that apathy was a very good thing. That apathy meant that there was less pressure upon the political class. And what is really, to me, quite interesting is that the political classes in Europe and Britain do not actually look in the mirror and ask about their own role within society. It doesn't really ask the question, are we really up to the job? And I think that one of the things that I'm doing a research project on this with my team in Brussels is, why is the political class so incompetent? Why can't they build things? Why can't they deliver? I mean, poor old Roosevelt in the New Deal managed to build the Hoover Dam, in an extremely speedy, fast car. Why can't we do something like that? And actually, there are a number of reasons for that, but the most important thing about the political class is they're incompetent. The kind of people we have in Parliament in the old days would have been parish councillors. If parish councillors, I don't think they would have been members of Parliament, and certainly the political parties no longer train and educate the future members of Parliament to be independent, intellectually courageous individuals. That basically means that if you look at Parliament, who's there, you're not exactly God's gift to political life, right? If you accept
It doesn't mean Josh.
I was waiting for that, Frank.
Yeah, there are exceptions, thankfully. So this is something that I think we got to bear in mind. We got to get away from a political class whose main characteristic towards people in everyday life is one of caring contempt. That sense of caring contempt that you hear on Radio 4 all the time from our politicians is a kind of sordid form of elitism that they themselves are not aware of, but they are simply unsympathetic to the predicament that most people are confronted with. So look, democracy is by definition always in trouble. And the reason why it's always in trouble is because it's a contract between the demos, the people, and the institutions. And that's always not going to be easy to work out and easy to sort out. And therefore, I think that, for us, what's really important is not so much just the institutions, although the institutions are important, but also the whole culture of democracy itself. I remember being in a debate in Amsterdam where I argued that I would rather lose an election, but lose it democratically, than win an election by essentially ignoring democratic norms. And this guy came up to me afterward and says, Professor Furedi, so you actually believe that democracy is good and in and of itself? And I thought, yes, I think democracy is a good in and of itself, but it is something that we got to live a little bit more than we're doing at the moment. And I think the challenge for us here in British society is to actually cultivate a culture of democracy and take democracy seriously and take arguments, debate, and yes, divisiveness and polarization, take it on board and embrace it, instead of trying to pathologize those individuals that raise important and big questions. Allow the populace to have a voice. Allow the people to find their own voice. And instead of there being two-tier policing and two-tier judiciaries, which seek to silence people who say uncomfortable things, let everybody have their voice and let 1,000 flowers bloom.
And thanks very much, Frank. Very conscious of the fact there's 3 politicians on the panel. 2 of us aren't even elected.
Yeah.
Right? In a debate on democracy. The journalists will be writing. I think you're safe, Josh. The irony is more with the rest of us. But anyway, a very different spirit there to finish with from Frank, be more optimistic about the possibilities of this fragility of democracy at the moment, and the excitement associated potentially with the emperor's new clothes being called, and so on and so forth. So, over to the audience. Right, we're going to take a clutch of hands, and we'll see how we get on.
I took aspects of what all you said resonated with me, so thanks very much. But I want to bring it back to specifically something that at least Baroness Stowell alluded to, which was the need to, sorry if I misinterpreted what you said, but the need to bring in business people who share the same vision of democracy to help the situation. I'm dedicating the rest of my life to improving the situation that we're in. I've built something which might help a little bit. It might help a lot, but it will certainly help. And during the last parliament, I wrote to every single member of parliament several times on a yearly basis, giving it 12 months between each letter that I wrote. Some of the MPs were extremely supportive of what I was doing. I literally just wrote to say, can I show you what I've built? Let me explain my vision. Some of them are downright hostile to me. Emily Thornberry is a dreadful woman. She really is. But
This point, you're to quickly.
the main problem was I was completely ignored by most of them. They didn't even write back to me. And, you know, if my name was Lord Ali, I would have got a reply. But it's not. My name's George Wilesmith. I live on a farm in Worcestershire. I earn £9 an hour, and I'm a complete nobody.
Thank you very much. Well, somebody now, can you just announce yourself to the world? Right, okay.
Yeah, my name is Anne-Elisabeth Brown. I'm really interested in the sort of grey area between democracy and politicians on the one hand and the state on the others, which particularly Josh talked about. I sort of felt that the last politicians lost or were punished by the electorate for having lost control of the state. I don't think democracy is going to be able to alter the state, even if we have a new government party. And it could be argued that the riots in the summer were inflamed by the fact that the state is just individuals, and those individuals seem to increasingly choose to apply the power of the state apparatus for their own interest groups' interests. So I would be very interested in the panel's view on that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what role, if any, you think education can play. So we've got an organisation in Scotland which argues that we want education, not indoctrination. So to what extent do you think democracy is important, and how can that be promoted in schools? And if people are interested, they should come to the store and find out what we're doing.
Okay.
Hi, I'm a teacher and I'm here with a school group, 17-year-olds. The class is divided between the compulsory voters and the don't vote, it only encourages them brigade. What advice would you give them?
Josh, you're a Labour MP, you're in government, you said our institutions don't work. What are you going to do to sort out immigration?
Adam Hibbert from Social Democratic Party. Much as I am wary of psychologizing in the political context, since we're talking about trust, I think it's really interesting how we tend to focus on what the political class needs to do. I have in mind a sort of analogy where the demos at the moment feels like a bit of a sort of betrayed wives club, where we could spend hours talking about all the ways he's gone wrong and all the things that he has to do to fix the trust problem. I'd be really interested in the panel's thoughts about what we, the demos, need to change in ourselves, regardless of what the political class has made us. As Josh pointed out, in many ways, the political class has tied its own hands. It's looking at us and it's, I can't change my ways. In that context, can we focus on what the demos want?
Okay, that's the person behind it who had their hand up. Yeah.
I wish I could be as optimistic. I understand the points that have been made about people being re-engaged in politics, but I'm from the United States, and the arenas for democracy have been shut down. I mean, we can't even put things in the press anymore. We used to be able to speak at school board meetings, and they've shut that down now. And I'm just wondering, I think there are people who want to do something, but when our elected officials are unaccountable, what should we do?
Okay. I'm just going to whiz across the panel, but I'm going to start, when we come back out, we start with that gentleman there. Just so that, right. Anne-Elisabeth, any quick thoughts on anything you've heard?
I'd like to put the notion of Brexit on the table, because the view of Brexit in France is that it was unwarranted self-harm. And I've spent quite some time on French television trying to explain why people voted for Brexit in Britain, and it got me labeled as a Brexiteer, which I'm not. Being French, I realized that from the inside you can do many things in Brussels, including not follow the rules. And the British were both extremely competent. The British civil servants annoyed the French because they were running sometimes circles around them, which means that in a comparatively short period of time, they managed to get the hang of it. But also because we need Britain in the EU. Britain was there was the kind of tripod in the founding nation, big nations, which were the French were about the power of the state, the Germans were about industry, and Britain was about free trade and opening borders. And the three of them together balance this. And now we have the Eastern Europeans within Europe who crucially lack the presence of Britain inside. And that's all I'll say about it. But all the same, I can understand, and it's very difficult, and I find it almost impossible in conversations, and that's just what I'd like to say, either in France or in Britain, to have a sensible conversation about this is what people talked about. Why? And you immediately get shouted at on one side or the other. I'm putting this on the table without thinking, but certainly one of the reasons why Britain was treated so badly in the negotiations, apart from the fact that the negotiators, I have it from Michel Barnier's staff, well, the British negotiators got into Barnier's office and they fought among themselves in Barnier's office, which really sort of did not help. But apart from that, there was the idea that it was a narcissistic wound to the blob, and to the people who will, tell you what to think and will not listen to what you're saying. And the idea that somebody could try and want to get out was offensive, especially somebody like Emmanuel Macron, who was a creature of the French state in so many ways, not mysteriously. He just studied and went through the channels. That is something that has to be changed, and I have no idea how.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, particularly the point on education, given my background in the Department for Education and Ofsted, I think we have a ticking time bomb in our education system in a number of ways. And I actually think it's risking at the moment making division worse in society. We don't think seriously about the importance of education when it comes to things like integration, when it comes to civic norms, when it comes to democracy. Just to give you an example, we have no idea in this country how many kids are being homeschooled. Now, there will be very many people who will be doing a great job with homeschooling. I also know from my time at Ofsted, there are kids in unregistered schools, there are kids who have been homeschooled who are basically, at risk of radicalization and extremism. And yet, the government has grappled with trying to do something about that for the best part of a decade and never be brave enough to do it. If we're going to have a populace that is united around democratic norms, we need to know very basic, like, what are our kids being taught? What are they learning? And right down to where are they learning? So I think it's a really important point. We need to rethink it right the way up. And just on the point about the demos, I think that's it is a key point. And I think politicians need to be braver in leveling with people. The interesting thing about Nigel Farage is I will do focus groups with some of the most left-wing, progressive, drippy liberal voters who will say, I can't stand Nigel Farage, can't stand what he stands for. But, there is something about the fact he just says it like it is and lets me decide. And I think some of that is missing at the moment and would really go to people.
So, in answer to your question about business, the point I was actually making was that the leaders, mainly of big business, have as much a role to play in changing things as politicians. I mean, to your point, it is clearly important that those of us within Parliament are listening and open to the information and concerns that people have that they want to share with us. I mean, Luke will be better placed than me to respond about how individual MPs do that with people in their own constituencies. I think once you've gone beyond the direct channel to your own MP, it can get very difficult if you were just trying to engage with people who have been identified as sort of specialists. But I think if you're following sort of what debates are happening in Parliament, I think the thing to do is to try and target people who have adopted a position on a particular topic. And one of the good things about Parliament now is that our website addresses are available on Parliament. So my address is there. And, when people when they use that email address, they expect it's going into a sort of, it comes to me, I do get emails like that. But I think to move on from the role of business, but connect it to the question about what the demos needs to do to change, to build trust, which I think is a really interesting point. I'd answer that in a couple of ways, really. I get really frustrated now how you see when we're sort of out and about in public places, the lack of common understanding of what behavior is acceptable and not. So things like, feet on the buses or on public transport. Now we've got this irritating thing where people sort of seem to watch a video, headphones have become a thing of the past for some reason. People are really selfish in the way in which they behave in publics. And I do think we need to both be, this is hard because, there's an increasing sort of amount of risk to this, but I think we need to be bolder in raising objections to that kind of behavior, support each other when we do. But I think we also need to be demanding of business leaders and to a certain extent unions in sort of empowering the people who are in charge of public spaces to actually uphold the usual sort of standards that organization would claim are what they want us to all to behave. I would like to see less signs telling me not to be rude and more signs saying that, we have a standard of service here that we want to offer, and we want our customers to help us maintain that standard. As in, let's all come together. That's what Paul has done. What's here about those? Well, I think my final thing is it does, though, come back in the end to leadership. And this is a job for us as political leaders to be out there making this case. I think one of the great disappointments of COVID was that when, put to one side for a moment whether you sort of thought the lockdowns were a good idea or not, when we started being let out into the community, as it were, there was a point then when we could have made so much more about the responsibility that comes with personal freedom. We could have made that could have been a reset moment, which we didn't take at all. I'd raised this in Parliament at the time, but anyway, that sort of got lost in the wind. But because I think that what we need to understand, and the final thing I would say is that for those who are business leaders, whether it's of public services or businesses where people are doing sort of, functionary jobs, we can't just get to a point where people know how to do a job, which is what they do now. They need to know why their job matters and why it matters that they do it well. And that's the same for politicians too, I should add. But because if you can help people to realize that they are in whatever it is that they do, then they will be much more empowered to be a more to have a sort of sense of leadership in their own small public space that others then will take some cue from. Okay, thanks. That's very useful. Yeah.
Doug. Yeah, let me just say three things. One is about caricaturing politics and what politics is. One is about the migration point, and one is about risk. So just firstly on politics, this relates to a few of the questions and also what Frank said. I think it's very easy to caricature politics as well as for politicians to caricature the public. So here's what I was doing yesterday. This is 3 months into my job. I spent 2 hours in A&E on the beds with average 75, 80-year-olds who were dying in the corridors of A&E. I then spent an hour with a couple. The guy is terminally ill and he wants me to vote in favor of assisted suicide, listening to their views on the issue. And then last night, I spent about 2.5 hours dealing with a flood in my constituency that for ages the Environment Agency have ignored. So that's what politicians do. Now, there's lots of things we don't do and don't do very well. And I absolutely think my class that I'm now part of have failed the public for a very long time. And actually, the politicians on this panel have said, I, for example, do not think that Brexit was the wool pulled over the public's eyes. I think mostly the public understood it as a constitutional question about what the parliament of this country can do, and they were right. And then when they voted for it, we had to do it. So I actually think, on the whole, that politicians are starting to catch up with some of these underlying questions, and it is very important not to caricature what they do, because it's easy and it's lazy, in the same way that being a politician, it's easy and it's lazy to caricature what the public do too. But the flip side of that is that politicians need to have a bit of humility, a bit of epistemic humility about what they actually know, and about what the people who are members of this class actually know about how to use the state and do economic policy and all the rest of it. And we've learned, I spent 5 years doing a PhD, and then what I basically learned was the people who tell you that they think they know everything don't. That's, the short summary of it. And I really believe that it's important to say that out now. But the last point on what politicians should do, democracy, the word comes from 2 Greek words, the demos and kratos. Kratos means power. The point of a democracy is to give power to the demos. And part of the problem with our democracy is that the kratos bit, the power bit, doesn't work. And that's why when the demos do anything or say anything, they don't feel the effects of it. And until we fix the kratos bit, the demos bit is never going to work as it properly should. Just on migration, I think this is one of the great questions about this kratos point. Why can the British state not control its borders? That is the question that the public asks constantly. I wanted to. I can just tell you that. I'm a human being. I want it to. So I'm not sure it's, it may not. But if so, who is it? And why is it that we keep electing for control over borders, electing people who say they're going to do it, and then it doesn't happen? So I think it is a great question of trust that we deliver on controlling Britain's borders. And I think that there is a very important international question about what an asylum system looks like that isn't just a legacy of the Second World War, but works for the world that we are actually in. And that is a very hard question because it requires you to think about judicial review, legal structures, and who's accountable. And those are uncomfortable questions for both political parties in different ways, but we must confront them and not shirk. Okay. So the last thing, just quickly on risk, we must all take more of it. Demos, politicians, and everyone else.
5 minutes, just only because I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. Very interesting things there, Josh. Frank.
Yeah, a couple of things. Just on caricaturing politicians, which Josh raised. You see, the way that I look at it, all the stuff you do, Josh, like going to the A&E and looking after those people, that's exactly what my wife does in Faversham. She has adopted several of those people that she looks after. She volunteers to do a whole lot of things. And in many respects, what you describe as, your day-to-day life is nice, is great. But I wish that politicians would be leaders, not managers, but leaders. I think that politicians need to stand out as standing for something important. They're going to be able to take risks, as you say, by, sort of in a sense, going on a line and demonstrating, giving a sense of direction to the rest of us. And we're not getting any of that. And I don't think that's a caricature. I think that in your heart to heart, you probably know that as well as just as most politicians do. And it seems to be that is the vocation of political leadership, which I wish that people would practice. I suggest that people read Max Weber, the German sociologist, on politics as a vocation, just to get a sense of what politics, should look like. On power, I think that power is really important, and power is something that we need to take seriously. And there are glimmers of what happens when the people are able to have more direct forms of power. I think we already talked about Brexit, and I think Brexit was worth it. Even if we had lost the vote, it was still worth it because people were consulted and people could express themselves. It's different than an opinion poll. It's much more direct and much more reflective and thoughtful. But if you look at something like the Irish referendum, which occurred earlier this year, where essentially, contrary to the polls, contrary to all the predictions, the Irish people rejected the idea that somehow the family, the traditional family, was now outdated and the words for it had to be changed. If there wasn't a referendum, then it would have gone through, even though most of the people were against that. And if any of the people would have protested against it later on, they would have been denounced as extremists, populists, misogynist, racist, or whatever. So referendums, I think, are a really good thing. They're not a solution, because in the end, representative government is really quite important. We need more referendums. We need more local referendums, which then involve people directly in this decision-making, so that their destiny is to some extent linked to something that is very real and very direct. But most important of all, and this relates to Demos' question, the Demos needs to become more confident in itself. At the moment, it doesn't believe in itself. It just reacts very often. And the only way it can become more confident in itself is if it sees victory, it sees positive things happening. We need a system of education that is a system of education. I don't want democracy education. I don't want values education, because they become indoctrination almost overnight. But if you really raise the intellectual level of our schooling, which is awfully low at the moment, then you create citizens who can think for themselves, who have intellectual confidence, who are then able to become...
Thanks, Frank. Okay.
On the 31st of July, I and 110 other people were arrested at random and for no good reason at a peaceful protest opposite Downing Street about the failure of the government to tackle increasing knife crime in the wake of the atrocious murder of the three little girls in Southport. It was a protest, not a riot, but for simply attending as an observer, where I said and did nothing. I was arrested and held in a police cell for 20 and a half hours. Yes, there were some actual riots elsewhere. But yes, I was a victim of tutelary. And yes, I am now taking legal action for wrongful arrest.
To the panel, this is my question. Do the panel agree
that the overuse of the term riot in the media and elsewhere is a dangerous stereotype and generalization?
My name is Richard Galvin. My question is about who actually rules this. Democracy is alive, but is it the civil service, the bureaucracy, or the courts that can actually, a law gets passed so they can just do away with it? Does sovereignty of parliament still exist?
Okay, good question.
Yeah, there's really interesting perspectives, particularly on like referendums. I want to know what people think about like Swiss style, like popular initiatives. Because the problem, I think, with referendums in this country and in most other countries is it's just when the legislators decide to consult the people, and particularly in first past the post, when there's this entrenched duopoly, it means that, it's only kind of when, the stars align that people actually get to decide. I think in Switzerland is a very interesting country in all sorts of ways, but I think the most significant thing about it is that anybody can get signatures for an initiative and call a referendum. And my question is, I guess, could that be something that is explored? Could there be like a campaign to try and bring that to Britain? Because actually, the reason why American states have initiatives is because they likewise in the early 20th century, we're looking at the Swiss example.
You may have seen Will Hutton yesterday saying how stupid everyone was. There's a 40 billion hole, and Brexit cost us 40 billion. Look at all you stupid people. And therein lies the point that a lot of you have alluded about the contempt, dripping, sneering, smearing, censoring, cancelling. The question about leadership and the demos and the power is never going to get given to us. We need to take lead. We need to give a lead. We need to inspire our friends, colleagues, and neighbours. We need to get them involved and put pressure on elected representatives and on everyone in the community. When we do that, all of our institutions will start changing. When we show that we win, we make those wins, and we should do that together. We've got a stall called together here. I'm really pleased we've got this discussion, but it's up to us. It is important to have these discussions, but let's all take a lead ourselves.
Okay, thanks very much. That lady.
Hi, I just wanted to respond to something that Luke said about homeschooling, radicalising, things like that. Maybe that's partly the case or sometimes the case, but I think there's a reason why people are going in droves to want to homeschool. My daughter, during the election, was told by 4 teachers that Farage was a racist. They conducted an election in the school for the kids. Green came first, very close second was Reform, and the head teacher dismissed it and tried to make it out that the kids were trolling and, that it was a problem in the school that a large number of kids had voted for Reform. In every single lesson, there is something left-wing, progressive, and alluding to the fact that if you don't have these views, you are a problem. My daughter has to shut up at school. And she's in a normal school. This is a problem. Yeah, for democracy.
There is this real sense, I think Luke mentioned it, about just things not working, and every new initiative just seems to make life harder. So it's virtually impossible to drive around London now. There are potholes all over the place. And what do we see? More cycle lanes, more cameras, more 20-mile-an-hour zones. So it just feels like they're just trying to make life harder for us. Just fill in the potholes, and that's your job. And this is all the way through everyday life. Now, why is that happening? There's an organisation called the Climate Change Committee, which has been around since 2008, Climate Change Act. It does a carbon budget every year for every government department. So there's rewilding and farming, it's carbon neutral hospitals, forget the waiting lists, it's 20-mile-an-hour zones and what have you. The whole of government has to sign up to this. Nobody talks about the Climate Change Act. Climate Change Committee. So even if a minister wanted to do something about it, the Climate Change Committee takes its power from legislation 2008-2019. So we need ministers to take back power, and for their power to be vested, to get a mandate from people to do something that they want to do. And unless that's tackled, then they won't be effective.
Okay, thanks very much. Right. This is a quick way down.
Hi, my name's Arian. I'm a Year 12 student at Michaela Community School. I'd like to make the point that
It goes against the spirit of Michaela to clap him before he said anything just because of what school he's from. I want he's meant to win our respect, not be clapped because he's from a particular school. Carry on.
in order to have a truly democratic or representative system, I don't think first past the post can work. I take the example of Reform at the general election. 4 million votes and only a handful of seats in parliament. That is not representative. That is not democratic. So what is the solution?
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
I am Lisa Mackenzie, and I am an anarchist. So therefore, I would say I'm probably the most democratic person here. I understand how power corrupts, and I want power to be used right at the bottom within the grassroots. Thank you, Frank, for telling people to read Max Weber, because absolutely in these times of bureaucracy. My question is about party politics and the way that party politics is driving us into mediocrity. And that is at the council level, the Westminster level, the crime and police commissioners, and also these local mayors that we've got.
I also wanted to come back at Luke quickly. I've just finished home educating my children the last 11 years. They've successfully out sixth form doing A-levels. But the registration point and we want to know what they're learning, I would just throw back at you. We've got parents in this country who are suing schools and local authorities to gain access to whatever materials their children are being taught. The schools are saying, no, we're not going to give these materials to you. I would say, I think it's part of the disconnect. You want to take more of our freedoms, but you need to get your own house in order.
Okay, thank you.
So we know from polls that politicians have different views from the public systematically in Britain and in Europe. Perhaps the issue where there is the widest disagreement is immigration. Political elites are just far more liberal on immigration. One of the questions I have is really, is this elite culture? That is, the culture constrains the elites to be super nice to what are considered historically marginalized groups and therefore not to express immigration restrictionist views? Or is it the recruitment of the political elite, and so only people with liberal or progressive views on cultural questions are being recruited into the political and media elite? Which of these do you think is the bigger reason?
I'm going to ask the panel to give us some final thoughts. I think one thing that is very clear to me is we don't want to romanticize the demos. That's obviously true, and so I think for me in this conversation, when we're actually talking about giving ordinary people a voice, I do it all the time, by the way. I do it all the time, but throughout this discussion, I think one of the things is about taking responsibility as well. Because one of the things that I do find in these kind of discussions is we have to avoid just not whinging. And of course, now that I'm in the House of Lords, I kind of can't do my populist we the people bit. I do it, but obviously it's a bit odd. But the truth of the matter is that you can feel as though you're saying, what are you doing for us, right? What are you doing? And it feels a bit cheap to me. I actually think moving forward, we have to make these things happen and change in a different way. And that's what I'm saying, is take some responsibility for what happens. The other thing is that Frank made the point about what's wrong with being divisive. It's a good thing. This is my advert now. Come to the polarization keynote tomorrow, because that's a fascinating thought. We use divisive as a negative, but actually we are divided, but that's okay. We can actually historically use that as the lifeblood of democracy, rather than what if we all agreed with each other? It would mean we'd stopped thinking. On the other hand, it's also true that sometimes we shout past each other by caricaturing our opposition, and that is what feels as though it's a threat to democracy. So that's my final thoughts. Okay. In the order in which you spoke, let me just get going. Yes.
Yeah, well, thank you for a great discussion. There were some great points. I just very quickly address a couple of them. I think there's a general point on is the riots. As one of my greatest frustrations is when I chat to lots of people. There's no doubt a majority of people in this country think that immigration is too high. A majority of people, a big majority, are concerned about levels of illegal immigration. And one of my greatest frustrations is when people on the left, and it's not all people left, it's a minority of people left, characterize them as bigots, as people who, actually it's just a cue for racism. My caution, though, is I think in how some on the right reacted to the riots, they gave succor to those on the left. Let me tell you why. It is abundantly clear that those people who took part in violent acts during the riots were coked up thugs. But by in some way saying they were speaking on behalf of legitimate concerns of people, you made the left's argument for them. Because what you were saying is all of that 60, 70% who were concerned about immigration are going and setting fire to asylum hotels, right? And the opposite is true. The vast majority of people who are concerned about immigration just want politicians to do something about it and to act and want nothing to do with people who are setting fire to migrant hotels. And I think it's really important to make that distinction because it allows people who don't want to get control of immigration to caricature those views. And then just because a few people have come back to me on homeschooling, as I say, can do a wonderful job. But when I was at Ofsted, we were going into unregistered schools. We were finding books where they were saying to young men, basically, you could beat women if they look at another man, if they do something this way. That can't be right. That is the basis for making an integrated society. We've got to get a grip on that. I appreciate some of the issues in schools need looking at as well, and we need more institutional neutrality in this country.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think, first of all, I just want to say Claire does a fantastic job in the House of Lords. She speaks on lots of different topics, and since she's been there, she's brought a great, fresh perspective to the House of Lords that has been lacking on so many topics. And so I just want to take this opportunity.
Very nice, isn't it?
I just want to take this opportunity to say that she does a great service as an unelected parliamentarian. I guess just a couple of things from me in terms of why. I agree with what Luke has just said, but to the question from Eric about why do I think sort of parliamentarians or too many politicians are find the topic of action against illegal or too high legal immigration distasteful. I think it's a combination of things. I think it's partly to do with the sense of a lot of politicians feeling they want to be on the side of what they consider, the kind of sort of moral superior type sort of position. But I also think it connects to something else, which is that we have increasingly over the last 30 or 40 years seen that those who come into politics, particularly I'm talking about the Commons now, increasingly they will all be people who have graduated through university. We have much less diversity in Parliament now in terms of educational background than ever before. And I think if you think that when people have gone through a similar kind of educational experience, higher educational experience, wherever they may have started in life, we have this odd situation now where there's more diversity in terms of social class. There's lots of people who would have originated from a working class, but they're all very similar in their outlook because they've gone through what I call the rinse cycle once they've got to university. And that's part of the problem, in my view. Just very briefly on sort of who rules us and democracy. I think that is a really, I think that is behind a lot of people's sense of frustration, that they demand action, but the people who they think have the power to do something usually try and point to somebody else saying it's their problem. And you see this at every level. Even my dad was telling me the other month about the fact he'd been demanding that there were some new double yellow lines where, on a road where the bus couldn't get down because of the parked cars. And the councillors, they keep pointing and nobody seems to be able to do anything. So, and I would connect that to the point I said about business. This is also, I think, frustrating people when they are trying to get through customer service, that sort of thing. They can't speak to the people who are in charge and have the power to help them put right what it is that they are experiencing as wrong. So I guess I will finish where I start, which is I think there's a lot for us in positions of authority to do to change things. I do think we've got, we should be able to do so, because I would just argue to those who say that, effectively, our electoral system is broken and you're no longer confident in it. You do have the power. You have forced change time and time again. The problem, as I said at the beginning, is that we are not understanding what you're demanding, or we are understanding, but we're just not doing what it is you want, and we need to change. I've heard Frank turn.
Okay, let me be super quick. One, I agree with almost everything that Tina and Luke have just said. I think the who rules question is the great question of our time, essentially. I think we have overly judicialized politics. I think we have too many independent agencies that sully and muddy what it means to have political power. I think voters notice that, and I think it affects how politicians and the public think about the exercise of democracy. Too quickly, it's too easy to say, lawyers told me to do this. Economists told me to do this. It's politics. You choose, you make arguments based on values, and then you take responsibility for them. And we've lost that a little bit. And that is downstream of this who rules question. Let me just say, on Luke's point about coked up thugs and riots, migration, as I've already said, is one of the most important questions that's a corollary of the first one that I was just talking about. I do not think we should blur the lines. I had a riot in my constituency. I went there. It was coked up thugs. So I think we should be very careful and very clear about that distinction, because I think it makes the moral argument harder to actually tackle. Literally nobody said that the 40 billion black hole is because of Brexit than anyone who said that. So don't know where that came from. And let's just end on Max Weber, because Max Weber's that essay, which I agree everybody should read. He certainly is not an anarchist, by the way. But he says it's two things we need in politics. You need self-interest for power, the pursuit of power for its own sake, and then you need some ideas, some sense of why you're doing it. And you have to hold the tension between those two. And I think we've got a lot of the first and not enough of the second. That is a problem, and that's why these spaces are very, very important.
There are three questions which I thought were worth noticing. The first one is about the first past the post system and how it has got to be changed. It is, when on the face of it, it's every single electoral system has good reasons to exist the way it is. And in a country that for a very long time was a country of two parties, in Britain, it gave the means to for one party to actually make good on their promises. And of course, if they don't, then we have a problem. The second question is about recruitment of people within the elites. And I don't think the recruitment is as unequal as all that. I think it's the peer pressure afterwards. It's the fact that you want to conform people at the beginning, you don't know it so well, and therefore you think, well, they must be right about this because I really want to do this right. And then very slowly and then much faster, it's almost impossible. And the last thing is that even in customer service, you can't reach a human being. I don't think I can insist too strongly about the fact that the entire system has defaulted to a position in which essentially they want to prevent you from asking something normally on a normal tone. And that has, I think, colored French politics, world politics, much more than we think. A French pollster and sociologist and political scientist, Jérôme Fourquet, has written an entire book about what consumer society has reduced us to. And it goes both ways because we then behave like angry customers. And that's really something to look at.
Sorry, thank you very much. Sorry. Frank, this is my fault for mistiming this, Frank.
Yeah, I just want to say something about the elites. There is nothing wrong with the concept of elites, as long as they are genuinely elites, as long as they've earned the right to be part of the elite, and they've learned the art of leadership and the art of risk-taking. All those are very difficult and important accomplishments. And the problem that we have, it's not an individual problem. The problem that we have is many of the characteristics we associate with leadership are not upheld and valued in our society. For school onwards, people are educated to play it safe. They're educated to limit themselves in terms of possibilities to conform. And I think that conformist culture has got a devastating effect. I just want to say something about the guy who got arrested. I was not in England at the moment when that happened, but I was shocked. I was shocked by the way in which the government actually forgot the fact that there's a distinction between judiciary and the political institutions, and the way in which the rule of law, which I really think is an important accomplishment, and judiciary independence was being violated by the messages that were being sent out. I was even more shocked by the two-tier judiciary behavior. And if you want to have an example, of the tragedy here, because I used to respect the courts, was the decision yesterday to give that woman 2 years in jail. And just pause for a moment, okay, this woman made a wild, horrible tweet, but to actually jail her and for such a long period of time tells me a lot about what has happened to the court system, that it's no longer an independent court, but has become thoroughly politicized.
Okay, thanks very much.